I'm going to ask all the speakers to come up. We do have a few minutes for some questions and discussion. I also want to make a special thank you right now to Joelle Van Dunkersgood, who is the rapporteur for today's session and who has been a great partner this whole weekend in kind of helping all of this happen. So, Joelle, thank you very, very much.
Question for our hazard topic.
Ken.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting dialogue between what he was saying about the fact that most of the World Heritage hazard response is addressed to physical, and much of the hazard world's work is addressed to human safety. So, it was framed as we can come to them with more information about how we protect places. But I'm wondering if that you could address the issue of maybe there's a dialogue, because when I've looked at hazard work, I found it lacking in talking about the protection of the physical and focused almost entirely on saving human life. And frankly, I feel like we are ephemeral and place is less ephemeral.
Yeah, as I've been listening to the discussion, I've thought that really there are two constituencies in this room. One that represents the established institutional forces that have resulted in giving us a World Heritage system, and the other a bunch of people who'd like to change that system. And I think it's exactly the same in the hazards research and management community. What the public sees as far too often as the management of something like flooding is resort to the Corps of Engineers in the building of a levee or some other construction. What the public doesn't see as much is that there's been a large community of researchers and some practitioners who've been talking about disasters that were waiting to happen, like New Orleans, for many, many years before Hurricane Katrina came along, and saying that an exclusive emphasis on technologies and the solving of events, or the attempted solving of events via technological means, while it's very useful to do that kind of thing, it shouldn't be the exclusive resort. That we need to understand much more about how people make decisions in the face of risk, and we have to change that part of what is the construction of vulnerability. So I think there is a dialogue, but it's like there are two sets of dialogues here. There's our dialogue in disaster risk reduction, which is aimed at changing existing practices, and there's your dialogue, which is aimed at the same thing in the cultural landscape environment. And I guess what we need to do is to get the people who want to make the changes together, to force the ones who don't want to make the changes to accept them.
Thank you very much, sir. I want Foster to respond to this. I think you rightly identified land use plan as one of the basic tools for landscape management. I'm speaking from the third world point of view. Now, this is quite expensive, and it also has a lot of political dimensions, especially as to its implementation. What practical solutions will you have, especially for us who are from the South, in such a way that such an effective tool could be used for effective management of the landscape? Then, Lizzie, you also did mention issues of mitigation and adaptation. Again, from the third world point of view, these are the responses that communities give to the climate change. However, there aren't adequate documentation as to which practices are the best to respond to these dynamics, which has taken us all by surprise. What practical solutions do you have so that we can also tap into that? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Fausto, and then Liz, please.
it is very important to recognize the contribution of geographical techniques to deal with the construct environment as well as the natural environment. It is really important to train professionals from the Global South in geographical techniques. There are many programs doing that precisely, even in indigenous community groups, whether up in the mountains or in the deep Amazon jungle. They are contributing, for instance, with what they call counter mapping. There are communities that have used laptop computers with GPS to actually demark the territory and try to bring about the notion of technologically driven planning. Now, this is one component. It is the language that everybody in the technical world will understand for the planning of that territory. What many people are now asking, particularly in Ecuador, which is engaged in what they call planificación de ordenamiento territorial, knowing that ordening or put some order in a territory is literally a Western imposition of thought into the social arrangement of these communities. They are now claiming to incorporate some of this ordening or planning to bring some order from the indigenous cosmological vision. And this is still in its infancy. We don't have results to show, but it has developed a fantastic conversation in scholars in Ecuador whether to incorporate technologically based plans of development with the inclusion of these type of social and community inputs.
I think what we were suggesting is that adaptation is going to be necessary. We are all going to have to adapt to the changing situation. There are tools and lessons from the past that hopefully we can bring forward from understanding past cultural traditions to use to be creative in how we adapt to this change. But at the same time, we need to be mindful of how we keep track of what was there at the time that the change started to occur. So mitigation, in a way, is recording the traditions and the information of the cultural landscape prior to the change. So mitigation might be trying to stop change, but it also might be accepting change, but understanding that you need to record information that may be useful in the future, that people may need to know in the future.
We wanted to make the point that traditional methods of mitigation and documentation are still incredibly valuable, and some of these amazing new technologies are not always accessible, so documentation like oral histories and the period plans that were shown are essential. And I think it's encouraging that the new generation of students is so much more sophisticated than we were at managing these systems, so what we need to instill in them is an appreciation of history, so that they want to make that commitment to mitigation. Does that answer the question?
My question was going to be about, is going to be about how Indigenous people are going to have to reimagine themselves in these contexts here, and also the question of institutions, what kind of institutions. But I also wanted to give a story from last year in Australia. I was involved with writing research priorities for climate change adaptation for Indigenous communities, and while we were all meeting up in the Kimberleys, there was a great big flood up there that completely wiped out an Aboriginal community, a remote Aboriginal community up there. While the event was happening, all the community elders, instead of running after all the infrastructure that was around that they lived in, they all ran to the art house to grab all the artwork and save the artwork. And it also brought up another interesting point where we have all these plans for climate change and impact and evacuation, but they're never followed up with plans to return a community to a place. Getting back to my question, I want some more, not so much cliches, but how Indigenous communities have to reimagine themselves into the future, and which institutions we're going to need to do that with.
Is that directed to someone in particular, or?
Yeah. Up here.
Well,
when I look at the Polynesian Voyaging Society as an institution, it actually was created way before the actual voyage. The canoe was built, obviously, before the voyage, but they were...
The canoe was built, the society was founded even before they found a navigator. So it was a sense on the part, I think, of some of the native Hawaiians of what they wanted to be, which was an ocean voyaging people, trying to recapture that. But it was also on the part of some of the scientists who were, in a sense, intent on refuting some of these theories that Polynesians just showed up because they got on their little rafts or canoes and let the Pacific take them where it would. That it was much more a human knowledge event or activity as opposed to just some sort of circumstance. Now, I think in terms of reimagining who you are, I look at some of the work that Jared Diamond did on Rapa Nui or Easter Island. And, he talks about the ecological disaster. I don't agree with it as an ecological disaster. I view it really as a disaster in that people forgot how great they were. It is incredibly difficult for, I think, native peoples to articulate the reasons why they were great, how great they were, and then to aspire to put into place the kinds of systems, institutions, the kind of curriculum that will get them to that greatness. One of the things that I like about Mao is that he understood the greatness of his mission. He understood that he had to work with the Hawaiians and help them in order to help his people, because his people had sense rejected their greatness as well. And he saw that institution called the Polynesian Voyaging Society and the hokulea, that canoe, as the instruments that would help him restore that greatness to his people. I don't know how you go about doing that, whether a cultural artifact precedes that, whether it's an art, a piece of art that's discovered, but there needs to be some sort of dialogue within the community to really discuss what's great about us.
One last question, please.
We heard good examples of traditional knowledge, traditional management, and and also its relevance in isolated way. Now, the question I would like to ask is, how does IUCN and the international system communicate this to the state parties, this wisdom to the state parties in a very consistent way, so that the community knowledge that exists in our regions will be mainstreamed and become part of the management, obviously, cultural business.
I'm not the spokesperson for IUCN. As a matter of fact, I had been rather critical in some issues on this particular respect. We do have in the audience scholars and practitioners that are much better qualified for me. But since I am here at FROM, let me just tell you, IUCN itself has been morphing, has been changing. And it is really very important to see how the contributions contribution of IUCN to the idea of protected landscapes and seascapes had been important in taking place to bridge that divide that it was very clear in the past between the fundamental biologist, conservationist, and the fundamental anthropologist, conservationist. And this is very interesting. A few years back, IUCN had a director general who was neither a biologist nor an anthropologist. She was a psychologist. And as a psychologist, she was able to manage the minds of the people to put together this. And I think that was critical. Yolanda Cacabatze now is actually the president of WWF. So now, eventually, with that psychological approach, we may find funding from WWF actually to be given to cultural landscape protection. One last point. IUCN is really made out of not just governments, but also civil society, NGOs. It is clear from the beginning of IUCN that it was a dilemma between whether the government voice should be the one to be heard or whether the NGOs and the conservation community could put their requests on the table. At IUCN, that is really very clear, and they have been having World Conservation Congresses every 4 years, trying to define exactly what would be the best way to go. Now, in the case of cultural heritage, every time I have asked the possibility to enter into the UNESCO frame, you have to be a state. You have to be government. And so I think IUCN could actually share that particular insight with UNESCO in increasing the reach of a worldwide institution by fomenting such structures similar to the IUCN within the UNESCO, and particularly on the World Heritage Program.
We are going to have to stop this panel now in the interest of time, and I want to thank the panelists very, very much.